the Germans, it was not easy to persuade them to give him up, but they were going to give him up for Navalny. That was what they were going to do. And then all of a sudden, Navalny is dead. Welcome to Shield of the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia, and dedicated to the proposition articulated by Walter Lippmann during World War II that a strong and balanced foreign policy is the shield of our democratic republic. I'm Eric Edelman, counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, a Bulwark contributor and a non-resident fellow at the Miller Center, and I'm joined by my colleague in this enterprise, Eliot Cohen, the Arleigh Burke Chair of Strategy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., and Professor Emeritus at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C. Eliot, welcome.
Well, it's good to be with you. I don't know about you, but I'm sweltering here in the Washington suburbs, although we are headed north to Chautauqua, New York, which should be much more pleasant.
I've escaped the heat by decamping to the eastern shore, where it's about 10 degrees cooler, and ocean breezes are wafting through, my front porch. So, I think both of us are doing the right thing.
I absolutely think so. We need to persuade our producer to do the same, but that's another matter. So, look, there are a whole bunch of things on the table. I thought, it seems to me there are three big topics. One is this prisoner exchange that just happened this week. Then, kind of possibly much darker, this series of quite successful Israeli strikes, the prospects maybe of a larger Middle East war. And then we will shine the light on you and your colleagues talking about the Commission on National Defense Strategy, which just released its excellent report.
Just fresh from testimony in front of the Senate Armed Services Committee myself. Look, I wish we just, it's been such a slow summer for news. There's just not enough to talk about. So I'm glad you were able to.
I remember when I became counselor, I went to to Secretary Rice's chief of staff, Brian Gunderson, and one thing I said is, by the way, what's the deal here with taking vacations? Do people even do that? He said, "Oh yeah, take vacation." He said, "Very, very important." He said, "Just don't take it in August. That's when the wars start."
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there's good historical evidence for that.
Yes, unfortunately. So let's go ahead and let's start with the prisoner exchange.
So can I give you a hypothesis and you tell me if you think I'm crazy, which is, my first thought, beyond being very glad that Evan Gershkovich, a number of other Americans, I think also some of the Russian dissidents who are really formidable people who have not been getting enough attention in the press were released. But I have to say, my second thought was, okay, why are the Russians agreeing to this now? It was clearly a long, complicated negotiation. The Wall Street Journal did an interminable tick-tock on the ins and outs. There are lots of different countries, the Germans, the Slovaks.
Yeah, it's a very
but at the end of the day, the Russians had to decide that they wanted to do it. And the initial puzzle for me is this helps Biden and probably by extension Harris domestically. Would you agree with that? B, would you agree with the proposition that the Russians would certainly know that? And then thirdly, that there's some degree of intentionality. And I will tell you my wild speculation, which is that the Russians are thinking of putting forward some sort of ceasefire proposal in Ukraine, and that they, I think, understand the susceptibility of any president, but particularly this one, to wanting to end their term in a blaze of glory as a great peacemaker. And so that the agreement to do it now is a way of kind of sweetening the pot and creating the atmosphere for a ceasefire proposal that the Americans will buy off on. Who knows what bets they're placing on the election, but like everybody else, they have to be thinking at the best, from their point of view, it's a toss up between Harris and Trump, and it may very well be Harris. So, all my wild speculations. I'd be curious to know what your view is.
So those are interesting speculations. I mean, I guess what I would say is number one, to the proposition that it, helps Biden and Harris. I think the answer to that is yes, but I wouldn't oversell the point, which is to say, I think it, it's certainly gives them a good news cycle, because, you know, uh, people unjustly detained or hostages, coming home is always a good news story, essentially. And there's a little bit here where Trump had been saying publicly, Putin will only release 7, Gershkovits to me. And Biden had a drop the mic moment yesterday at his press conference when people said, "What do you say to the fact that Trump, said anybody could have done this?" And Biden said, "Okay, well, why didn't he do it when he was president?" So yes, it helps Biden and Harris, but I would also say the half life of this is very short. The caravan will move on, the campaign will keep going, and I don't know, foreign affairs just in general, doesn't usually play a big role in presidential elections, and in particular, as we've gone through the last few cycles, it's played very little role really. And so I would, the Russians may have thought it would help a little bit, but I'm sure they didn't over sell that point. I mean, I think certainly the fact that it now looks like it could be a toss-up election, I think may have helped with the timing. But this has been, as you say, in the works for a very long time. If you look at the Wall Street Journal article, which I did look at this morning, and as you said, it was, I don't know that it was interminable, but it was very long and very detailed. This has been, been in the works for, quite a while, but it may be that the Russians did calculate that, look, if Trump comes back, Trump will be Trump. But, if Biden and Harris come back, we want to have some money in the bank. I don't know that I would expect a ceasefire proposal right now, because I think Putin probably is still hoping, and I think a lot of his, propagandists are suggesting are still hoping Trump wins, and Trump still is the favorite in the betting markets and everything else. But they may have that as money in the bank to do something, after the election if Harris actually is elected. And I think they already have a sense of what Trump wants to do because Viktor Orban has told them, about his conversations with Trump at Mar-a-Lago. And the Trumpists have published their proposal, which Putin has already said meets kind of with his approval. So I wouldn't anticipate an early ceasefire proposal. I could be wrong, but maybe something after the election. Very very plausible. I had a different speculation, which I'd be interested in your response to, which is when you look at that TikTok that the Wall Street Journal did of the whole course of the negotiation, it's I have no evidence for this, so it's just circumstantial timing. But the fact that it was coming together just around the time of the Munich Security Conference, and the Germans were being motivated to release Krasikov, this FSB assassin, now confirmed by the Russian government that he was in fact an FSB agent who killed a Chechen dissident, in broad daylight in Germany. The Germans, it was not easy to persuade them to give him up, but they were going to give him up for Navalny. That was what they were going to do. And then all of a sudden, Navalny is dead. And I wonder whether this was Putin wanting to get his guy, who, by the way, also was a member of his bodyguard. He was one of his, bodyguard protective detail. So he had a personal connection to this guy. He really wanted him out. But I think at the end of the day, he couldn't face actually letting Navalny go. And I think circumstantially suggests ordered they be killed before this could all come to a head.
Yeah, I mean look, I wouldn't put anything past Putin. The thing that's interesting about what you just said is, so on the one hand, Putin is clearly a completely unsentimental guy. On the other hand, he is a sort of a mafia don, and you have often made the point, which I think is entirely correct, that one of the prisms through which to view modern Russia is as a mafia state. You're not the only one who said that. One of the mafia rules is you kind of look after your own. I mean, particularly if they're the ones who are doing the wet operations. So there's that. There is something on the other end too. The Russians have this long tradition of exiling dissidents. I just bought the authorized abridged edition of the Gulag Archipelago, which is the abridgment that Solzhenitsyn approved of, and which is supposed to be quite good. I'm looking forward to reading it. I read the Gulag when it came out, but I was thinking that the Russians kicked him out, and why do they think these guys do less damage inside the country in a prison than on the outside? And that's why I really wish the American press would. I mean, understandably, everybody's caught up in with the American hostages, but Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is, to my mind, someone of even greater stature than Navalny. Navalny had his problematic sides, although he was also extremely courageous and evolved over time. And the Ukrainians, for example, still, have a kind of antipathy to him, which they don't have towards Kara-Murza, who's a genuine liberal in the old-fashioned sense, and who has a good pen, which Navalny didn't. He's a writer, and was it Solzhenitsyn who said writers are the consciences of their nation, or is that?
That sounds like it could be, but I'm not sure. I can't.
Either Solzhenitsyn or Václav Havel, I think, but I think it's Solzhenitsyn. It's a very Russian kind of view of the world. You wonder if they'll regret that. They released the guy who's the head of Memorial, the founder of Memorial, which was documenting all the crimes of the Soviet era.
And some of the people around Navalny were released also.
Yeah. So did they think those people don't matter, and they don't care if they're on the outside? Is it so important to get their own killers back? Or do they think, and this is another possibility which some have said is good, this consolidates the tradition of taking hostages, and then you get your people back that way.
So number one, you're 100% right that this is a sort of the criminal enterprise element here speaking out. This was the headline apparently in all the Russian newspapers today. We take care of our own. We bring ours back. And that was, across all the major, tabloid newspapers in Russia today. I think, the tradition of exile, I think that you talk about is that these people, are stirring up trouble in the country. And there is a deep-seated Russian fear of disorder. And these people are creating disorder at home. Better to kick them out and have them somewhere else, fulminating against us than creating disorder at home, I think is the mindset. And I think it's deeply kind of embedded, in Russian culture. I mean, so look, Trotsky gets exiled, Lenin is exiled, even Stalin spends a period of time out of
and it goes Russia. Back way before that, Herzen.
Yeah, of course.
Plenty of
And
others.
as you say, Solzhenitsyn, they were happy to get Solzhenitsyn out. Ultimately, they were happy to get Sharansky out and to,
Yeah. But what's odd about it is, they have this elaborate prison system. You would think that they would say, and look what, and they can kill people. I mean, they do kill people. They killed Navalny. They've killed plenty of journalists. They killed Boris Nemtsov,
Right.
and yet they somehow prefer to exile them. It's a curious thing. Do you share the view that some have expressed that it's a terrible thing to do these kinds of deals?
So I wanted to get to the moral calculus issue here because I think it's a very hard question. On the one hand, um, there is a kind of moral political hazard here, which is when you negotiate with hostage takers, you are in effect incentivizing future hostage taking, and you're rewarding terrible behavior. And you know uh, from a conditioning point of view, you're conditioning your adversaries to do more bad things. Um, on the other hand, there is the moral imperative of trying to get people who've been unjustly um, you know um, imprisoned by Russian authorities out, particularly when their health is at risk. Their lives are potentially at risk. People were talking about Paul Whelan's health condition he's been in since 2018. The potential, you don't want anybody to die over there. And, I think there's a special, it's especially important to get people out who are working on behalf of either the U.S. government or, a element of the government. So, for instance, the RFE/RL reporter who's a dual national, I think we had special obligation to try and get out. So I think it's a difficult balance between doing these things, and it's you feel almost churlish because obviously you can see the joy on the face of Evan Gershkovich's mother at Andrews Air Force Base, and you think to yourself, how could I possibly be against this? Look, in this instance, and plus, I mean, there's one other element here. It says we're not trading like for like. We're not giving up.
Well, that's the point that people have made. Yeah.
You're not giving up. People that we've imprisoned for political reasons. You're giving up assassins and hackers and scam artists. Who've bilked people out of money on the internet. And so it's not a like for like trade. In this particular instance, I think we got twice as many people out as they did, and there was no cash exchanged, unlike some of the Iran hostage exchanges that we've had. At least one of which I've testified against in the Congress. So in this instance, I think probably on balance, it was the right thing to do, but it's one of those things that might be the right thing to do, but it leaves a bad taste in your mouth.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm more at peace with it, and having bashed the administration for all kinds of things, I do give them credit for orchestrating a complicated deal.
I do as well. Don't get me wrong. I think that the diplomacy of this was handled very well, and Jake Sullivan, who you and I have both criticized on this show from time to time, I think played a particularly important role in keeping this on track. And deserves a lot of credit. I mean, this was as diplomacy goes, this was between the intelligence community and the diplomats, very well orchestrated.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I suppose I also take a little bit of solace from the fact that usually when people get caught and go or simply kind of flee back to the motherland, they don't do all that well. I mean, it's not like they really have happy lives, Kim Philby, Guy Burgess, they weren't caught, but they ended up fleeing to Russia. They both become drunken louts, which they were kind of on the road to being anyway. So I'm just hoping that they have miserable lives when they go back, although it's probably not true. What's her name? Maria Butina,
yeah.
Yeah,
She's a member of parliament now.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
so are the guys who poisoned Litvinenko. One of them is a member of parliament as well, I think. One of them, I think, passed away. The other one, I think, was in parliament. But so, yeah, I mean, they don't. Kim Philby, by the way, was when I was serving in Moscow in the embassy, was still around, and
Wow.
and he was a broken down drunk, and people would occasionally run into him, at restaurants and stuff. So he was still
Yeah.
around.
You never did though.
I never did. No. People also
Uh,
ran into Molotov. Um, Molotov
really?
Molotov was still alive, and uh, not when I was in the embassy. When I was on the desk, actually, which was before I was at the embassy, Molotov was still around, and people would run into him in the park, and the embassy officers would occasionally run into him. He would feed the pigeons, and they would try to engage him in conversation. He would never talk, but
Yeah. Well, there's a whole separate topic of conversation. What happens to these communist apparatchiks when their glory days are over? I mean, of course, the biggest one is Khrushchev. And we maybe someday we can talk about this, maybe the Taubman biography of Khrushchev and what we make of him in retrospect. I think we probably should move on to talk about a much darker subject, which is the prospects for a broader Middle East war. So this past week, what we've seen is the Israelis killed in a strike in downtown Beirut the number two in the Hezbollah hierarchy, but he was more than the number two. He was really sort of the military mastermind. And as was explained to me by a senior Israeli official, when Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, wanted something done, an attack plan or something like that, he would go to this guy, and this guy's the guy who would make it happen and who had been responsible for really building Hezbollah up into a formidable military force. So this was a very, very bad guy. A guy who was also on our wanted list for the Marine bombings. And then this spectacular assassination in Tehran of basically the head of the Politburo for Hamas, staying at an IRGC, an Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps guest house, with a bomb that had been planted there 2 months ago, if you believe the New York Times, on just as the new Iranian president is about to be inaugurated, a huge humiliation. And I think I would couple these two events with, in addition to a whole range of Israeli strikes in Syria and Lebanon that have killed quite a few Iranians, to their retaliation against the Houthis for this missile that landed in Tel Aviv, where they really pummeled Yemen's main port and its ability to import oil. So they inflicted serious pain. I don't know how many people they killed, but they did a lot of economic damage. I have to say, in each of these cases, I find myself cheering them on and kind of wishing that we would do the same, at least vis-a-vis the Houthis. And the people like Shukr, the Hezbollah guy who we were trying to get, and I've been hearing different arguments about it. Now, there is one argument that this is a bad idea, that this is going to interfere with the hostage negotiation, that killing the top guy may feel good, but another one steps in to fill his place, that the Iranians and Hezbollah will feel absolutely obliged to retaliate on a very large scale with the concomitant risk of a much broader Middle East war. Where do you come down on all that?
Well, to the litany of things that they've done, we should probably add confirmation that the July 13th strike killed Mohammed Deif, the operations chief of Hamas.
Yeah, who had been really the operational planner, as I understand it, for the October 7th attack. So this was a guy who
Right.
they had wanted to get for a long time.
Right. So essentially, of the top three leaders that of Hamas in Gaza, who the Israelis have been after from the time they started the operation, they've got two of the three now: Marwan Issa, who they killed earlier this spring, and then now Mohammed Deif, and leaving only Yahya Sinwar, the military head in Gaza of Hamas, to go.
And by the way, just to said when the same official who would be in a position to know, I said, by the way, do you think you're going to get Sinwar? He said, no question about it. He said, sooner or later he will make a mistake, and as soon as he makes it, we will kill him.
I have no doubt about that. So there's a question of motive, and some people have ascribed to, Bibi the motive of wanting to, torpedo the hostage negotiations. And there's a case that can be made, I think, for that, because Bibi has added a whole number of, conditions to the negotiations. Does seem clear that he's not in a hurry to get them done. I mean, that he's been criticized by his own defense minister, Gallant, about that, and certainly by opposition leaders like Lapid and Benny Gantz. My own sense of this is that this actually had less to do with that than it was a fleeting target. They had the opportunity and they took it. My view always is Occam's razor, the most parsimonious explanation is usually right. And now, did it occur to Bibi that when he approved this, that it might also delay the hostage negotiations, which he's in no hurry to do? I mean, you'd know better than I do. When does the Knesset go out? Are they out already, or they're about to go out?
I don't know, but I mean, it's a tiny country, so if things happen, they'll be reconvened.
Well, no, but the speculation has been that he's been waiting for the Knesset to go out of session in order to agree to the ceasefire deal when Smotrich and Ben Gvir can't really bring down the government.
I mean, possibly. I mean, like you, I don't actually interpret it quite in that light. I do think let me say a couple of things. One is I would stipulate that maybe apropos of our earlier discussion, the dilemma that the Israelis face is horrific. They desperately want to get the living hostages back.
Who are a dwindling group.
Yeah, who are a dwindling group, and I mean, it's horrible, just utterly horrible. On the other hand, they have to think about questions of broader purpose, and above all, something that's always at the top of Israeli strategic thinking, what they talk about, restoring deterrence. And now there are problems in some ways with that concept, but the Israelis have, really almost from the very beginning, have thought that such a heavy part of their strategic doctrine is convincing their enemies that, you throw a punch at them, they'll do something much, 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 much worse to you. And that furthermore, Israel has overwhelming superiority should it care to exercise it. Now, obviously that took a terrible blow on October 7th. So I think they've been, they have been looking for opportunities to do this. There's also an internal reason, which is, the Israeli morale has been, I mean, in one way, they've been very staunch and resilient, but another way, it's terrible. I mean, they've been losing soldiers. The war has been unending. They are very much aware of their own isolation, which is not complete, but there's an element of that. They're aware of the wave of anti-Semitism that has swept the world, and they worry to some extent about that. And so, you rack up a couple of big wins. That's important for people's morale. Now, people may tisk about that, but, you and I are citizens of the country that launched the Doolittle raid in 1942, where, shortly after Pearl Harbor, FDR decides that we'll fly a bunch of medium-range bombers on a one-way mission to bomb Japan, with the idea that they'd parachute or crash land in China, a mission that, wasted, I forget how many airplanes, something over a dozen, that was very dangerous for the crews, and really could have no military impact of any kind, but that Roosevelt thought was necessary to restore American self-confidence after it had taken this terrible beating at Pearl Harbor. So I think there's an element of that that's going on here as well.
So I think the larger, and I'd be very interested in your view of this, the larger strategic sort of conundrum that I think the Israeli leadership is facing is this. Number one, what's the theory of victory in Gaza? I mean, I was talking 2 weeks ago to a retired former senior Israeli military intelligence person, well known to you and me, who basically said, look, we have essentially, we've really destroyed Hamas's military capability. Right now, there's not much more to be gained by continuing military operations in Gaza. I mean, strikes periodically, like the one that killed Daif, and if we get news of Sinwar, obviously, as you were just saying, to do that. But the ongoing operations, they're clearing areas and then moving on, but they're not holding, and they're certainly not doing any building in a kind of counterinsurgency kind of framework. The North is a huge problem waiting for them to deal with, and you gotta. I mean, if you're gonna get into a bigger war, right? You want to take if you're going to do anything on the ground the way they did in 2006 in southern Lebanon, they're going to have to get the forces in Gaza out and rested and replenished and refitted, and they're not. I mean, I know they've rotated some units in and out, but you're the expert on this. You tell me. I don't think they're anywhere close to being ready. They've talked a lot about how they're ready to do a lot in the North, but it doesn't strike me that they really are ready. And a war in the North could be. I mean, even this retaliation could be. That the Iranians are talking about. Who knows what it'll be? But if it's a combined missile attack, say from Iran, from Hezbollah, simultaneously, the Houthis in Yemen, maybe some of these actors in Syria and even Iraq, coming from multiple vectors, it could be very hard to defend against, harder than the one on April 13th, and could inflict enormous damage on Israel, whose economy has also been suffering enormously from the war in Gaza. So, I mean, how do you work your way out of that, kind of strategic maze?
So I don't know. I'm trying to write an article for the Atlantic just to figure it out for myself. So a couple things. One is, again, just to kind of follow up on the previous conversation, in theory at least, a set of successes like the ones they've had can buy them the domestic political room to make some sort of deal in Gaza, in which so maybe some people leave Gaza or who knows what. And so there's an element of that. Unfortunately, I don't think that's how they're thinking. I mean, I think, and throughout, the term counterinsurgency is just sort of foreign to the Israelis. They don't think about it that way. Now, I think they are beginning to put together. They have various groups that are putting together ideas, but as you and I have discussed before, there's no particularly good idea for the governance of Gaza. I mean, it's just a terrible mess. There's a good piece by Dan Byman in Foreign Affairs where he goes over all the logical possibilities, and as is so often in the Middle East, they're all terrible. So there's that. On the purely military side, they actually don't have many troops in the Gaza Strip at all. They've seized what they call the Philadelphia corridor, which is basically the border with Egypt. And my understanding is that that's really enabled them to finally really disrupt the tunnel network into Gaza, which the Egyptians did various things, but there are plenty of opportunities for corruption and stuff like that. So things flowed in. It's much, much harder for things to flow in. They go in and out. And they are allowing quite a bit of aid in. I mean, it gets hijacked by criminal groups. They may be willing to live with that. Their big issues, I think, from a military point of view, is of course it's a reserve army. They wanted to give those people a break. That's really, I think, the most important thing. Let them get on with their lives. And a war in Lebanon would be horrific. I mean, it's the Hezbollah has something like about 150,000 rockets. It would just swamp the Israeli missile defense systems. What the Israelis would do if something like that were about to happen would be, I think, preemptively hit every single launcher that they know about, and they know about quite a few. And the net result of that is extraordinary levels of devastation for Lebanon, particularly southern Lebanon. Now that then takes you to the other side. So from the other side's point of view, there are two problems with that. One is if you're Hezbollah, although on the one hand they are a creation of Iran and they do Iran's bidding, they are rooted in the Shia of southern Lebanon. And one of the big questions, and I don't know anybody who's given a definitive answer, and I don't know that a definitive answer is possible, who can tell you, look, how much do they really care about that population? At a certain level, Hamas couldn't care less about the population of the Gaza Strip. They're martyrs for the cause. The more of and they've said as much. The more of them that get killed, the better. Given the ultimate ends they have in view, it's not clear that Hezbollah is like that. For Iran, though, they've got a bigger challenge. So on the one hand, they have to strike back. I'm sure they feel after this extraordinarily set of humiliating punches to the jaw that they've taken. I mean, you just can't emphasize enough. That's on the president's inauguration in the IRGC guest house, a bomb that was there for months. This honored guest of theirs, they're going to have to do something. On the other hand, Hezbollah has been very useful to them as the loaded and cocked pistol that you really don't get into a gunfight with. You might every now and then fire around. But if they got into an all-out war, unless they really thought that they could destroy Israel, which I don't think they can do, and I doubt that they think they can do, you will lose. You have to consider at least the possibility that you're going to lose that cocked pistol that you always could have on the table to intimidate people. And they don't want that either, because then they're in a much weaker position going forward, particularly as they edge closer to nuclear weapons. So the Israelis are not the only ones with a dilemma. The other side has dilemmas too.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, there is one other possibility, though, which is Iran in the past, when it's been smacked and humiliated, has sometimes actually chosen not to respond, at least immediately. Think about Soleimani, but even think about the Airbus being shot down. At the end of the Iran-Iraq War. I mean, they chose actually not to respond. So it does strike me that there's potential here that they might decide to hold their fire, but that's certainly not consistent with what they're saying right now.
Yeah, the reason why I think there may be a break from the past is, first, they were in a really weak position when the Airbus was shot down. Secondly, with the Soleimani hit, they did fire a barrage of missiles,
right,
at was it El Assad?
Yes, it was El Assad.
And we were good, but we were lucky,
right,
that we didn't take quite a few casualties.
They may feel get hurt. I mean, just no one was killed, but we have
about 70 people with TBI,
right,
traumatic brain injury. So it was not a trivial thing, and they may feel that they have more of the upper hand now. The other thing is, they have made public announcements that, particularly the Supreme Leader has been making public announcements that they're going to do it. And finally, I think the humiliation here is just beyond. I mean, this is it's even bigger than the assassination of what's his name, Fakhrizadeh, the head of the nuclear program,
Right.
which the Israelis didn't talk about. I mean, here it's so undeniable that it's the Israelis.
Right.
It's your guest, so there's a cultural weight to this. It's the
The day your
president's
president's
inaugurated.
inaugurated.
Yeah, I don't think you do it. So I don't know. We'll keep an eye on that account. We're time is flying by, I see. So I'm going to begin, Eric, by saying knock knock.
Who's there?
I will ask the questions. So for the next and final part of this session, what I'd like to do is question you a bit about this very interesting document that
Okay.
you helped write. It's the Commission on the National Defense Strategy. You are the vice chair of the commission that wrote this.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff to unpack here, and I'm afraid we won't have time to do it, but I'm sure it'll resurface in a variety of ways. Could first just tell everybody, what is the Commission on the National Defense Strategy?
Yeah, so, as a matter of law, the Department of Defense is required to come up with a defense strategy at the beginning of every essentially presidential administration. It's a requirement in the National Defense Authorization Act that Congress passes to authorize the activities of the DoD. And Congress, going back to the late 90s, they did it, and then they restarted the pattern in 2010, has periodically chartered independent commissions to review the strategy documents of the Department of Defense. It used to be called the Quadrennial Defense Review, then it became the National Defense Strategy. And the Congress has wanted essentially a second opinion by independent experts, bipartisan. And so 6 years ago, I co-chaired with the then former CNO, Gary Ruffhead, a commission that looked at the Trump 2018 National Defense Strategy. And I was the vice chair, as you noted. Jane Harman, former representative from Los Angeles area in California, former member of the House Armed Services Committee and of the House Special Intelligence Committee, was the chair. And we produced a bipartisan, unanimous report that found a lot of deficiencies in the existing national defense strategy, and a lot of concern about the resourcing of defense and how we're thinking about defense and about the defense industrial base and its capability of producing what we need as a nation to both put ourselves in a position, hopefully, to deter war, but if deterrence fails, to be able to prevail in war.
So, one thing that does strike me about it is, we're always bemoaning the absence of bipartisanship, but this is a bipartisan document, right?
It is, and I won't say that it was all unanimity in the sense of our discussions were very animated, and there was some differences among us about key issues, but on the major issue, which is that the United States is now facing the most complex and dangerous international security situation it has faced since the Second World War, as Bob Gates argued on this show with us, some months ago. There was unanimity, and on the fact that the United States is not prepared to deal with that, there was also unanimity, and the fact that it will require additional resources to deal with that, also unanimity, and that we will have to spend those resources differently and on different kinds of defense systems, unanimity, and on the fact that our defense industry is not up to the task right now, and that our public remains woefully uninformed about this. Unanimity on all those questions.
Just to give people a quote, this is from page 66. The result is a U.S. military that is minimally operationally ready today, but is unlikely to be ready for tomorrow. And previous versions of that have had of this report have had other fairly stark language. Could you just say, top line, where do you think the current national defense strategy is off, or where either you speaking for yourself or you speaking for the commission? Because when I think about the current national defense strategy, which I'm not particularly a fan of, but they talk about China and Russia and North Korea and Iran. They acknowledge the defense industrial base is an issue, that readiness has been an issue, that it's a dangerous world. So, okay, what is truly distinctive about this, as opposed to things that the administration, particularly in the current national defense strategy document, have already been saying?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot to unpack in that, and so first, I think it's important to note that the 2022 defense strategy was actually written in 2021, in the first 9 months to a year of the Biden administration, and to its credit, it built on much of what was in the 2018 Trump strategy, which was to identify China as what both documents essentially say is the pacing challenge. It's the most serious long-term challenge that the U.S. faces. But it was written before the war in Ukraine, certainly before the Gaza war broke out, and before we had seen the intensifying cooperation that we've seen between Russia and China and with North Korea and Iran in support of the Russian war effort. And both the 2018 and 2022 strategies basically say we should structure our military to be able to fight one big conflict, essentially the Indo-Pacific. And in other areas of the world where there might be stuff going on, we will deal with that essentially with nuclear deterrence. And these strategies both, eschewed an attempt to deal with the problem of what if we end up having, simultaneous conflict. I mean, one of the deficiencies we found in the 22 strategy is that it described Russia as an acute challenge. Well, we don't think it's an acute challenge. We think it's a chronic and going to be a persistent challenge. And so when you have a strategy, essentially it says we're ready to fight one conflict and we're going to essentially take risk everywhere else, it puts you in the position of, let's say there was an Indo-Pacific contingency that came up, Taiwan or South China Sea. You end up having the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff going into the President and say, the President says, can we fight and win this conflict? And you have to basically tell them, Mr. or Madam President, yes, but we will be at high risk, of being unable to deter or defeat anybody anywhere else. And, what president is going to, choose to stand and fight under those circumstances? So when you say you have a one war, force planning construct. And I really think what you're saying, in effect, is you have a no war construct. And so that's, I think, a very big part of that critique.
If I could add my own 2 cents on that one, I think, and I think the chapter on foresizing constructs is right. It's a mistake to think about one war as a regional war. It's an Indo-Pacific war. If you're at war with China, there'll be things happening in Latin America. There'll be things happening in Africa. There will be things happening in Europe. And, the chance is that a Russia, particularly the kind of malignant Russia that you have now, which already thinks it's at war with the United States and with the West, and which wants to get revenge, will be part of it. The other thing, and this is just a crotchet of mine, which you've heard before and indulged me in, is the idea of a pacing challenge, which makes it sound as though, not like war where people are trying to kill you and you're trying to kill them, but it's like a racing bunch of greyhounds, with a fake rabbit that they're all chasing. And one of the reasons why it's a misleading metaphor is, you know, Russia is a different kind of threat than China. Iran's a different kind of threat than Russia. They would operate in different ways. I think they probably would operate in collusion. But it kind of gives you the idea that, which has always been, I think, one of the pitfalls of our strategic planning, of the lesser included case. You know, that the kinds of forces you need to deal with Russia or Iran are kind of a lesser included case of what you need to deal with China. And that's just palpably false. I think one of the other real highlights of the report, which I want to draw you out on, there's some quite stark graphs about defense spending. And, where you really see, I wouldn't say defense spending falling off a cliff, but it is going down, not up. And when it really needs to go up in quite a serious way, could you walk us through that? First, what the existing trends are, and then what are some of the barriers to spending the kind of amount of money that we need, and what is that amount of money?
So, this will be the part that really gets people's attention. So, first of all, if you go back to sort of 2010, when we had a commission, I've been in all four of the commissions: 2010, 2014, 2018, and now 2022 to 24. We're already cutting the defense budget at the end of the Bush administration. But Obama administration came in and there were defense cuts. And then you had the Budget Control Act, which sequestered the defense budget.
Remind everybody what sequestration is.
So basically, this enforced because the Congress was unable to come up with a budget deal, across the board budget cuts were imposed on the entire federal government, but in the Department of Defense. And the result of all this has been essentially from 2010 on, our defense spending has been relatively flat when you include inflation. Even as the challenges and threats have been gathering and becoming more complex and more dangerous, as our adversaries are ramping up their own defense capabilities. In 2018, when we talked with Secretary Mattis and then Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Joe Dunford, even before the 2018 strategy was completed, they basically said they believed the department needed 3 to 5% real growth in spending above inflation in order to meet the Obama administration strategy, which was, as you recall, a pivot to the Indo-Pacific. And the strategy they ended up adopting in 2018 was, in fact, even more ambitious. So our commission concluded that 3 to 5% was at least the baseline of what we needed to spend. Now, in the Trump years, President Trump likes to say that he built up the Defense Department, rebuilt the department, with budget increases. And he did, in fact, have 2 years of 3% growth for his first 2 years. The next 2 years were flat. And we've had, growth that's been under 3%. The Biden administration, Congress has added money to what the Biden administration has asked for, but we've been essentially flat. And the graph I think you're referring to in the report shows, had we had 3 to 5% growth, what the budget would look like, and it's like that. Then if you look at what the budget has been, it's been sort of like this. And so what we say in the report is we think we need for the next year or two to have 3% to 5% real growth. And, there would be disagreement, frankly, among members, whether it need to be closer to 3 or 5. I personally would be on the side of 5, and so would most of, my colleagues who were appointed by one side of the aisle as opposed to the other. But everybody agrees it needs to be at least in that range, and that we then need to be on a ramp up to a level of effort that is at least commensurate with the kind of effort we made in the Cold War. I mean, if you make the argument, which we do in the report, that we're facing an international security situation that is as challenging as the Cold War was, in many ways more challenging, and if you add to that the point you made, Eliot, which is correct, which is it's hard to imagine any conflict in the Indo-Pacific that doesn't become a global conflict very, very quickly, in part because of collaboration between Russia and China, but also Chinese activity in Africa and Latin America and elsewhere. It will become a global conflict very quickly. We need to be, we're spending barely 3% of GDP now on defense. In the Cold War, we averaged 4.95%. We need to be at that level of effort.
Well, you would only get hearty agreement from me, of course. But I'm curious, last question, since we are coming to the end here. How were you received on Capitol Hill? And do you think this will make any difference or not?
I hope so. I try to keep my expectations in, reasonable, check. I don't want to, fall prey to irrational exuberance. We were, I think, very well received by the members of the Senate Armed Services Committee. I think Chairman Jack Reed and Ranking Member Roger Wicker were both very complimentary of the work we did. Most of the other members, both on the Democratic and Republican side, I think, were very receptive to the arguments we were making. I made a point, for instance, about collaboration between Russia and China that we've seen recently in the strategic area, where people have poo-pooed the idea that you would see it, with the Russians and Chinese, flying joint strategic bomber sorties over near Alaska. And Senator Tim Kaine, basically said during the hearing, I said, I remember when you, Eric, testified earlier about this 2 years ago, and people poo-pooed it, and now we're seeing it happen. So, there were, some members didn't show up. Senator Elizabeth Warren, who was very critical of our report in 2018, did not show up at the hearing. Josh Hawley, who I would have expected to be critical of the fact that we want to be active in multiple theaters, not just in the Indo-Pacific, was not there. So he, did not make his critique. But I would say there's a broad, vital center, if you will, in the committee that was very receptive. Now, the members of the committee are people who spend a fair amount of time wrestling with questions of national defense. So they are more open to it. How it will be received in the Congress as a whole, I think, is a whole other question. And how it will be received by the general public is also a question. Part of our, our report is that the, political class in the United States has not done its job in explaining to Americans how dangerous the world is right now, how much it could affect their own lives and particularly their prosperity, and of course the peace, of the country, and why it is, going to be necessary to devote more resources to it. And we do take up the question of, how would you pay for all this? And we do say that, we will need more revenue. We will need taxes. And to get 4 Republicans to say that, was not easy. But we also got 4 Democrats to say, we have to also reform entitlement spending. So,
oh my goodness! You can't just soak the billionaires.
Yeah. So, as The Economist wrote when it covered our report, it said there's something in here to annoy everyone.
Well, always a good measure of success. Well, thanks. That was wonderfully clear. We're going to sign off now, but it seems to me there's a pretty dark discussion in a way. So I'll just ask you one last question. I'll give you my own answer really quickly. What are you reading for pleasure?
I'm actually reading a book by Neil Gaiman called Neverwhere, which is a wonderful dark fantasy, which it seems like the appropriate genre for the world as it is today.
So I just finished a new biography of Ian Fleming, which is really interesting because it goes into what he did during World War II. And it's probably along similar lines. I'm about to begin a book by Lev Grossman, who's kind of like Neil Gaiman, actually, which is his take on what Arthurian England was like after Arthur's death. I think it's called The Bright Sword. So I'm glad you and I at least are reading something that's fictional, but I am not surprised that both of us are reading things that are actually pretty dark.
I'm not surprised you're reading Lev Grossman, since he has made magic one of the major themes of his work.
Yeah, he absolutely has. All right, well, have a good weekend, Eric, and we will be back.
We will indeed.